Oh my God, I'm so excited. Thank you, Bobbie, for being here in another edition of Alex Sass Show.
I'm happy to be here.
So I can't wait. I need to introduce you to our audience first.
Okay.
Well, not like they don't know who you are. You have a million followers on your blog for some of your articles, maybe all of them. So technically, to introduce you, you are a spiritual seeker.
Yes.
You are a blogger.
Yes.
You're spiritual traveler connoisseur.
I would say a spiritual tourism connoisseur.
Spiritual tourism connoisseur.
Yes.
Sorry. You are a friend of mine.
Yes.
You're also co-host of the radio show we did together.
About 2 years ago at Radio Humsafar. That's
And
correct.
you are a regular contributor to our Mysterious Radio.
That's
yeah,
right.
That's so exciting. And you recently just came back from a spiritual trip.
That's right. From Italy and France and
you're
mostly
going to share most of that.
later. Yeah, for
How
sure.
did it all started? Like, how do you, like, at what point do you become like a spiritualist or blogger blogging about spiritual things? What like kind of makes that move?
I think it kind of started with my upbringing, being Bengali Muslim here in Canada, but also because we're Bengali, a lot of the friends of the family were Hindus and Buddhists, so I grew up with all of that around me. And then growing up in Quebec, going to Catholic schools, so growing up with Islam, Catholicism, Hinduism, and Buddhism was very, very natural for me. So as I was becoming more familiar with all the different traditions, I began to see parallel teachings in different traditions. And I realized that, you know what, we need to start building bridges because teachings are pretty much the same in different traditions. So I went off to Turkey about 18 years ago to teach English as a second language, and that was kind of transformative for me because that's where I met Patriarch Bartholomew, the head of the Greek Orthodox Church, and through him I met the Dalai Lama. And I had a lot of weird and wonderful kind of experiences in Turkey, meeting a lot of spiritual teachers and going to some really, really special, mysterious, weird and wonderful places like Cappadocia, which is the main image on my blog. These are places where a lot of the early church fathers came out of, and the energy there was still very, very pure. And that's how I kind of got into spirituality. So
are you a spiritual groupie?
I guess you could say that. I would say no. No, I'm not a groupie. I think I'm more of a seeker. Yeah.
I think that was just me being facetious because I know you wrote this article on your blog, and let us know the name of your blog, please.
The blog is called The Shift Has Hit the Fan. It's on WordPress.
And it's very clever.
Yes, there you go. So, yeah, and then I came back to Canada and I got into a program through Johns Hopkins University being a level 5 trauma counselor. So this is it where, you are talking about love and light with patients. It's real life and death. People are going through a hard time. Like there are people who are dying, basically. And this is where you really put your theology into practice. So that was kind of a baptism of fire for me. And then after that, I came back to Montreal and I started learning about Native American spirituality with a Native American elder up in Maniwaki, Quebec, and learning about the Sweat Lodge, the Medicine Wheel, and Native American spirituality in general. And that's when I really saw there were so many parallel teachings coming out of like different traditions. They just used different terminology. So I decided I didn't really think about starting my blog at that point. I think I started writing about my blog around 2012, when I started seeing that a lot of these so-called yoga teachers and yoga gurus were being outed as sexual harassers and, people who were not very nice and not just claiming to be spiritual and having lots and millions of followers, but they weren't doing anything but anything spiritual. And I realized that there were a lot of Westerners who were following for Indian gurus, and a lot of these godmen of India are just charlatans. And I felt that, somebody needs to speak up here because there's a lot of people who don't know anything about India, don't know anything about Indian culture, and don't have that discernment to see who's a fake and who isn't. And I needed to out them, I felt.
Did you feel that they were always kind of on the dark side and just took advantage of gullibility of people, or was it absolute power corrupts absolutely kind of situation? Because as they became more famous, maybe more popular.
I think Gurus Gone Wild is a phenomenon that's been going on since the 1960s with people like Osho and the Maharaja and, the Maharishi, and, Yogananda. there's a lot of these gurus that Westerners come to India and become devotees of, and a lot of them are sexually abusing people behind closed doors. They're Sai Baba, who is a very well-known guru. He's since died, but he has followers, people like the founder of the Hard Rock Cafe, for example. And the guy was a hermaphrodite, and he would abuse little boys sexually, but because a lot of these gurus and ashrams bring so much money, into the Indian economy through tourism, the Indian government looks the other way. They don't say anything about it. But in the meantime, you have a lot of Westerners who are being exploited by these gurus. So, yeah.
So money rules the world. Is that the same thing? Like, do you see a parallel between what's going on in the Catholic Church with all the abuse?
I think it's everywhere. I don't think it's just in Hinduism and in the guru or the yoga world. I mean, of course, you have spiritual abuse. It's spiritual trauma and spiritual abuse.
Because a lot of people find something therapeutic and safe in the way that maybe the spiritual synergy can provide, like God will save me, right? So
the whole thing with spirituality is that it can be a very healing modality for a lot of people. But the problem is that you have people who are taking advantage of their role and their power as a teacher or a guide or a guru. And at the end of the day, these guys are not helping people. They're actually causing more harm than good.
100%. But again, my question still stands. And in your opinion, is there anybody you can actually endorse as a guru, so to speak, that is neutral? Or they don't have to endorse anybody. But again, going back to the original question, do you think it's because often those healers start from the position, or gurus, they start from a position where they want to heal or enlighten themselves, and somewhere along the line, maybe they get corrupted. They get corrupted.
Yeah, that's a possibility too. Of course, that happens in many instances. But I do think there are a lot of genuine spiritual teachers and gurus out there in the world. I just don't think that they necessarily have millions of followers. They don't necessarily have a Facebook page or an Instagram page. I think these are people who are just minding their own business, living their lives, and they're very quiet. They're very private about it. They're not putting themselves out there, and they're not looking to proselytize people to, come to me and follow me. They're just doing their own thing. They've achieved a certain amount of spiritual integrity and knowledge, and they have faculties that you and I do not have, and they just want to be left alone.
How do you know?
I'm sorry?
How do you know I don't have those faculties?
I mean, if you did, you would probably be living in the Himalayas somewhere.
That's very judgmental of you. I do. That's where my cabin is, in the Himalayas.
Okay. But yeah, I think there are spiritual teachers everywhere. There's a lot of Native American teachers who are legit, spiritual teachers. I've met some of them, like Grandfather Martin, who was the head of the Hopi reservation in the Hopi tribe. He has since passed on. But he was one of the last Hopi elders that actually went to the United Nations in the early 1960s to deliver the Hopi prophecy that, the end is coming here. He was one of the last ones. The Dalai Lama would go see Grandfather Martin privately. And I know this, he'd gone to see him privately 5 times for advice. Like, that's the kind of person Grandfather Martin was. And he lived in abject poverty. He lived in a hovel in the Hopi reservation. No electricity, no running water. But that's the way he decided to live. There's Native American elders that are legit, teachers. There are some Indian, gurus. They have ashrams, but again, they're not very well publicized. They're very, very low key. And
word of mouth, like it's a natural kind of thing.
Yeah,
right?
And if you're ready for it, you're going to find it, type of thing. There are Western mystics that a lot of people don't seem to know about. People like Daskalos, who was a Cypriot mystic. In fact, my first spiritual teacher was a student of his. There's people like Michael Ivanhoff, who was a Bulgarian mystic. There's a lot of them, and a lot of them seem to be from Eastern Europe, actually, and the Mediterranean world, not so much from the Anglo-Saxon world and North America. There's John of God, for example, but he's gotten to be a little bit of a circus down in Brazil. There's teachers everywhere. It's just that
what about David Icke? Is he a teacher? Is he a prophet?
He is. I don't think he's a prophet, but I do think he's a teacher. I think he's got some legitimate things to say. I don't necessarily agree with everything he says, and that's fine. His attitude is like, here's what I have to say, take it or leave it, and it's up to you to take it or leave it, right?
What is your connection to David Icke?
A couple of my articles, when I started my blog, I wrote one about why, gurus, why the age of the guru is over, and why we all have to become our own gurus and our own spiritual seekers. And I cited David Icke in that article because he talked about something called the truth vibrations, where we're entering into this new age, whether you want to call it the Kali Yuga or the age of Aquarius or whatever, where it's going to be very, very difficult to lie and to be, put out bullshit. There's this new energy vibration, if you want to call it, the cosmos is entering into.
Why do you think is that,
epoch.
in your opinion? Like, I don't want to interrupt you, but really, that's interesting to me. Why do you think it will be difficult to lie? In my opinion,
It's the energy is going to be much more pure. It's
or
going to
maybe,
be.
what about
it's
people just more intuitive when they catching other people's bullshit right
that
away?
that too, that's part of ascension, but it's also the media. It's much harder for, let's say, cops to lie about killing somebody, because of things like the internet. Everybody's got a camera. That's part of that energy of this new age that's coming in, where it's going to be very difficult to be a bullshitter because people's bullshit detectors are going to be much more.
Was that why we
fine-tuned.
see a lot of censoring? Like InfoWars got censored, Facebook censoring pages and everything else?
Part of it, but like I said, I was talking about David Icke and his idea of the truth vibrations, and then and for whatever reason, I don't know how it happened, but my article got picked up on his website, and his website gets something like 65 million hits a month. And from what I understand, he followed my blog ever since. So after that kind of put me on the blogosphere map, so to speak.
Wow, that's really cool. You're very famous. We're very lucky to have you here. Thank you for coming. That's it. We have the show. It's perfect cut. No. So let's get to the nitty gritty of things. Like there's, I'm interested in the subject of ascension. That's a really cool article that you often get invited to Mysterious Radio and other
That's right.
outlets to talk about. Let us know about that.
So this kind of touches on the topic we just briefly talked about, which is about this new epoch coming in and the age of Aquarius. Part of that is that there's going to be a spiritual evolutionary change among human beings. And some people are getting these changes sooner than others. That's not to say that not everybody's going to get them. But ascension is basically, it's an evolutionary process. We're already evolved physically. The next process is going to be a spiritual evolution. And part of that is that there are certain symptoms of that. So some people are becoming very sensitive to the kinds of foods they eat. They don't want to eat meat anymore. They want to become vegetarian. Some people become very sensitive to the plight of animals. They find that animals, have human-like characteristics, and they become much more empathetic as a result. Some people are becoming much more sensitive to sight, to light, to sound. They hear high-frequency sounds. Some people are experiencing prophetic dreams. They're becoming much more intuitive. And again, this is going back to what we talked about earlier about their bullshit, meters becoming much more sensitive. Some people just find that low frequency, interest that used to really absorb them before, things like, gaming and watching porn, just no longer interest them. They just want something deeper and real. They don't want, flighty, kind of, impermanent kind of interests that just don't satisfy the soul anymore. I think people are just becoming deeper and they want things that are more authentic and speak to the soul a bit more.
So you're saying basically, if for some reason you feel uncomfortable in your present life, that's also one of the ascension symptoms.
Yeah,
Meaning
like
you no longer get along with your
with your old
friends,
friends,
you don't
right.
like your job, you're looking for something else to do, maybe new hobbies, something that you don't feel like there's
You're basically, there's a spiritual and a hunger in the soul that you're looking to fulfill. And the old interests are no longer fulfilling it anymore.
So that's not a bad thing. Basically, what you're telling people, that's a good thing.
It is a good thing.
So it feels like, and let me, I guess, rephrase this. If you're a kid, you remember this, and I don't know, maybe in India that didn't happen. That's me being facetious. But when you were a kid and you were wearing shoes and you couldn't run no more because your feet hurt because your feet outgrew your shoes, that's an uncomfortable feeling.
Right.
But then you go get yourself some new shoes.
Yeah,
And then
that's
right?
that's a very simplistic way of putting
It's a
it.
simplistic way of doing it. But
Right.
like, if you feel like you're no longer getting along with some of your friends, co-workers, even family members.
But you see, this is always this. If you're going to take a spiritual outlook in life, this is one of the big teachings. It's where you chafe and where it hurts. Those are the exact places where you can grow the most, and which are the biggest opportunities for growth in life.
Oh, that's a perfect allegory for that. Yes. So let's talk about some like, what about all the stuff that's going on around, like how do you fit in with all the supernatural stuff, UFO stuff that now is like a lot more visible and more exposure that we
I think
get?
it's just because there's more information out there. It's not like, where people didn't have cameras before and, you can just dismiss, the cops could just dismiss it. It's like, oh yeah, I was just lights at night or something. I think there's just too many people around the world that are waking up and tuning in, and they're sharing that information because of things like the internet and YouTube and so forth.
So you don't feel like we are actually more aware of this because we are growing and we're developing some different senses, and we maybe even our mind is.
I think it's a combination. I
Okay.
think it's like, different factors kind of moving in at the same point.
All right. So I guess I'm more interested now at this point to know more about who's behind the blogger and the friend and a spiritual tourist connoisseur. Like you talked about briefly about your upbringing and very diverse background. But there's got to be something that you don't just start on the trip because you're very observant. You also probably had some supernatural experiences that got you to that.
I wouldn't say supernatural. I think I've had some spiritual experiences. But I think it's also the way I was brought up. My father, when he was very young, spent a lot of time in the Himalayas, trekking, working for the Indian government as a student, surveyor. So he spent a lot of time in places like the Himalayas and Assam. Assam is a part in India that is known for magic. So I think he had a lot of strange experiences there, which he refuses to talk about with me now. But I've always had the feeling that he saw something, things like levitation and stuff like that. Some of the gurus doing some of the things like that up there. Even now, Assam is known for magic. It's known for, black magic, white magic, all of that. So I kind of had that in my background, like, with my dad and being exposed to all of that kind of stuff. In terms of myself, I think I've always had an interest in how spirituality can heal people. And that's why I decided to be a trauma counselor and do my master's in that. And learning different nomenclature from different traditions so that you could use that so that the person you're talking to can understand what you're saying. Because it's no point in me talking about high esoteric stuff like from Sri Aurobindo or whatever, when the person in front of me doesn't understand that. So I need to be able to understand that, but put it into language that they can understand, given their background, their cultural baggage, and their religious baggage.
But also at the same time, whatever you learn from the Indian, like you said, you can see something similar in Western traditions.
Absolutely.
So South American traditions, there's always,
right.
They may call it differently and they may look differently, but at the end, it's all the same
It's
thing.
all the same. Like, I mean, one of the most vivid examples that I came across was if you go to India, especially to southern India, if you go to some of the Hindu temples there, you're going to see a big lingam stone, which is very phallic. And then there's the yoni stone, which is very, feminine, obviously. And you will see the Hindu Brahmin priests pour milk over it and put garlands of flowers around it and worship it. And people who don't know any better say, well, why is he worshiping this rock? Well, it's basically the lingam stone and the yoni stone represent the cosmic male and the cosmic female, that you cannot have creation without the principle of the male and the female working together, ever. Whether it's bees, flowers, kids, you cannot create without a male and feminine principle at work together. So when I started studying with the Mohawk elder, one of the things she taught me about was the pipe ceremony, the Native American pipe ceremony, where you have the bowl of the pipe, but then the long stem of the pipe. And that, again, exemplifies the female with the bowl and the long stem with the male principle. So it's the same thing in a totally different...
Hold on. Don't. So what did you put in the bowl?
Well, I mean, you smoke tobacco.
Okay.
Right.
I'm just making sure. I mean, it is legal. You can share it now.
Whatever,
you can
but
do whatever. It is legal now, right?
The Native American pipe ceremony involves a holy pipe. But I mean, again, it exemplifies this whole idea of the masculine principle and the feminine principle. They're just totally using different, cultural artifacts, if you will.
Oh, this is great. So what's your personal practice? I mean, I know you dabble into some spiritual practices. Do you meditate? Do you do, I don't know, do you adhere to any kind of routine?
I don't have a specific routine anymore. I think I'm like, I think you kind of touched on this where I'm a bit of a spiritual tourist connoisseur now. And I just came back from Italy, spending time in Assisi, where St. Francis is from, obviously. And I didn't, again, this is one of those weird coincidences, but the day I showed up in Assisi was his feast day. So it was.
Is it coincidence or alignment?
I have no idea. But I mean, it was just like, it was a coincidence. And almost all the, it was full of Italian tourists. Which was great. You go to his basilica, you see his grave, you see where he's been, the churches that he received enlightenment. Because there were stories of Saint Francis levitating and talking to the birds and stuff like that.
I thought it was Padre Pio.
No, Padre Pio is the stigmatic. He's the stigmatic monk.
But isn't he also a flying priest?
I don't know if he was levitating. I think there were stories of Padre Pio levitating as well. But I mean, Francis also had the stigmata. But what a lot of people don't know is that even if you go into the main town of Assisi and you have the basilica and you have his remains there and his relics, there's a hermitage about 4 kilometers away behind the town up in the mountain where he would actually meditate and pray in the mountain and in the forests. And it's a grotto. It's literally caves on the side of the mountain. It's still covered in forest. The Franciscan brothers and the monks still look after that mountain. Hardly any tourists go there unless they're pretty hardcore. And I was able to spend time in the cell where he would actually pray and meditate for about half an hour, and that was really interesting.
How was the energy of the whole place? Do you feel it? Because I know you...
I'm pretty sensitive to the energy of places, which is how I pick up which are the places which are really... have a healing,
Tell me more about
potential.
that, because it kind of segues right away into your spiritual tourism. And like, what does it mean for spiritual tourism?
Well, if you were to look at the human body, you would see that we all have energy meridians running through it, and which is what Chinese
Like Eastern
acupuncture-
traditions, yeah.
Chinese acupuncture and acupressure work on that. The energy meridians of the body. If there's an imbalance, you press a certain place, it releases energy. You put a different needle somewhere else, it puts in energy. Likewise, if you believe that this planet is alive, the planet also has energy meridians. Now, different spiritual traditions have different names for it. The Celts and the Druids would call them ley lines, Ley. The Chinese would call them dragon lines. The Indians call it Vashu Shastra. I'm talking Indians from India. And the idea being that there's these energy meridian lines crisscrossing the globe. And for some reason, places that are, which there are holy shrines, have an abnormal amount of energy. And it's because they're intersecting lines there.
So like a plug-in kind of place.
Kind of. But the thing is, people forget, this kind of really hit home when I went to Rome, especially to Vatican City, is that a lot of these places may have a lot of energy, but over time it can get downgraded. At the same time, there's a lot of places on this planet which the energy is still very pure, but nobody knows about yet because they need to be reactivated, or these are holy sites that which have gone into disuse or have been forgotten about over time.
So that's exciting. And so you actually felt that energy, or was it one of those dead places?
I'd say Vatican City was one of those dead places, but then I felt it in Assisi at the Hermitage, at St. Francis's Hermitage. I also felt it, surprisingly, and I think maybe this was just a reaction to Vatican City because it was so crowded with thousands of Chinese, Russian, and American tourists getting into the Sistine Chapel. Like, it was just a very disagreeable experience, Vatican City and St. Peter's. But there's a church in Rome called the Basilica of St. Paul outside the walls, which actually has the relics of St. Paul the Apostle. Now, the original church had burned down 200 years ago, so they created a new basilica there. But because it's a little bit out of the city center, you have got to take a couple of metros to get there. The energy, hardly anybody was there. Like, it was like you had this vast church to yourself, and the energy there was off the scale. Like, it was just fantastic. Because I think part of it was like you actually didn't have tourists, but you had real pilgrims going there. And I kind of stood outside, and I was watching people coming out of the church, the basilica, everybody had a huge smile on their face. So to me, that was an indication, okay, there's something going on
It's one
here.
of them light places.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So in terms of the tourism, like spiritual tourism, tell us more. Like why, like if I don't know, why would I go on a spiritual tourism site other than to look at the sites and like if I'm
To
just
have an experience, because
Okay.
I think a lot of these places, because of the energy there, whether it's the ley lines or because of the centuries of people, sending prayers and meditations there, there's a high concentration of good energy, if you want to call it that. And it makes it much more conducive to actually have an experience or a spiritual breakthrough when you're at one of these places. I don't recommend going to places like the Giza Plateau or the pyramids anymore or Machu Picchu, just because the over touristification of the place has ruined it. On the other hand, there are a lot of places that are totally off, under the radar, totally off, the beaten path, which this energy is still very, very strong. And if you find those places, those are the places where you can probably have a breakthrough.
But I heard about Giza Plateau that is still sort of some kind of energy machine, and like the coffin in the middle of the main pyramid. If you
First
lay
of all, you're not allowed to go inside the pyramid anymore. They've closed it off. There used to be a sarcophagus there in the king's chamber, from what I understand. And in the 60s, people would go in and stay all night in the chamber or meditate in the king's coffin and have crazy, weird experiences. There's a story, actually, that Napoleon, when he went to Egypt to conquer Egypt, he spent a night in the king's chamber. He laid down in the king's coffin, in the coffin there.
and it fit him just right, I heard.
Well, apparently something happened to him. He was terrified and he ran out and he never wanted to talk about it again. And after reading some books from Daskalos, the Cypriot mystic I was talking about earlier, he said that the ancient Egyptians were very, very deft at actually putting spells like into the walls of a lot of these rooms and chambers, so that under certain conditions, I don't want to say an entity, but something would come out. And if you weren't in the right frame of mind and you weren't ready to receive it, it could scare the hell out of you.
It's an interesting question. In entity, what do you mean by entity? Ghost, alien, interdimensional
Could be
thing?
anything. Spirit. It could be a spirit. It could be energy. I mean, the thing is, if you, it kind of makes me laugh, when physicists, decide to be atheists or scientists, because, one of the first and second law of thermodynamics, right? Energy and matter cannot be created nor destroyed, but it may be transformed. And I think with death, that's just a transformation of the soul's, energy, if you will. And sometimes people live in a bad way. Sometimes people live in a good way. It's just still just energy, and it could be good or bad, whatever the case may be. Some people become ghosts, I guess. Some people don't. Some people become angelic presences. Some people are protective guides. It really depends. But I don't think I don't think it's wise to dismiss it completely out of hand, that there is something there that we don't completely understand. And maybe we just don't have the physics and the mathematics to understand it yet.
But like you said, it's part of the science of ascension. To learn new things is through observation, and that's how in science we'll learn new things, by observing the environment and maybe hopefully getting...
Physicists and scientists and mathematics can actually prove up to 22 dimensions exist. In theory, in paper, they can prove it. We just don't happen to experience them. We only experience basically 4, right?
Well, I think
And
some
5
people do.
if you include time.
What about like empaths and sixth sense and
But I think
clairvoyance?
this is like evolution. I think there are some people who are a little bit ahead of the evolution.
But is it another dimension? What I'm saying, is that another dimension of sort?
It could be. It's just that they're just accessing a different realm or a different dimension, and they're getting information from that possibility. I don't know. But I think these are questions we need to be asking about, obviously.
Are you optimist or pessimist? Because you mentioned it multiple times, like years changing. End of one year came, 2012 came and gone. They build
epochs. It's a change of an epoch, right?
So is the world coming to an end, or is it sort of one of those phoenix rebirth things?
I don't know if it's so much an end. I think it's more, it's an evolutionary leap. I think we've had the physical evolution. I think the next transformation is going to be a spiritual one. And I think some people are going to make it and some people aren't. I don't think it's going to be an apocalypse, end of the world, the horsemen of the apocalypse. I don't believe in that. I think it's more, we create our own hell and we all create our own heaven. Now, I mean, if you just look at the environmental degradation, we are creating our own hell. At the same time, we can also create our own heaven if we decide to solve these problems in an intelligent way and, in a more collaborative way. When we start getting rid of things like racism, when we start getting rid of things like nationalism, when we start looking at each other as one human family, I think that will go a long way, for example.
Yeah, you and me didn't build borders or invented passports, but we have to obey by those rules.
Yeah.
And I mean, you and me personally, individually, cannot fight against it by own, but let's rise up. I have guns in my basement. No, it's a joke. So, but actually, we talk about the ascension symptoms and all those spiritual uprisings, so to speak. Is it new? But again, like you said, maybe it's always been there. It's just more available to people because of the new communication system that we have.
I think more people are becoming more conscious of these things. And, maybe in the 1960s or 1950s, you would have one person in New York City, having a strange out-of-body experience, astral travel or whatever. But she doesn't have anybody to talk to about it. She doesn't have any books to read about it. There's nobody who she can communicate about it. But now somebody can have an experience like that, and they get on the internet and they can find out, oh, wow, there's thousands of other people in the world who are also experiencing the same thing. I'm not the only one.
And they can start seeking answers.
Right.
That's really cool. So the idea is a lot of the things that you describe, I mean, do you believe, like a lot of people now come into a conclusion that what we live in is like a simulation, like matrix of sorts?
Yeah, I mean, I know there's that famous, Elon Musk talks about this a lot, that we're living in a simulation. I think a couple of weeks ago he was on the Joe Rogan show and he was talking about it as well. Mm-hmm. This is not a new idea. If you go into Vedanta and into Hindu philosophy, they talk about that this world is an illusion. They talk about Maya. Maya is the great illusion that we have to, in order for us to become enlightened, we have to pierce through that veil of unreality to experience real reality.
So it actually happened a few days ago, and this whole new term came, NPC, non-player character. It's the video game character, but it kind of reflects onto the matrix, the whole aspect of the matrix that we hear, kind of programming our own reality individually, or maybe manipulated by some other forces in terms of having the perception of what world we actually live in. And the symptoms of ascension that you're describing, is a lot of them is sort of those veils are being removed, and maybe the new communication system like internet and everything else, and like
has something to do with it, right?
Something has to do with it. Like I see it the way is your ascension symptoms that you were describing is the way like a character in the video game leveling up. You gain more skills, more abilities, and with those skills and abilities, they can take on more tasks and actually maybe see beyond the veil of this deception. And maybe going back to our original topic with all those gurus, do you think because they were exposed to such power, they were easily decepted, or like you said, corrupted? Like, is there any link do you see
I think when you start getting the adoration of millions of people and the money starts pouring in, I think no one can take that kind of pressure. I think eventually most people buckle under that. I think the real spiritual gurus, like I said, the people who are very low key, who are minding their own business, who are very, very, off the beaten track, don't have web pages, are not looking for followers. They've achieved something. They want to stay in that something. And if you want to come and learn from them, hey, that's cool, but they're not going to go looking for you.
Is it maybe part of your spiritual growth is actually to confront this darkness, so to speak? Okay, I have this power and I can manipulate people for money and sex and other things and all this other stuff. But then your other side of you says, no, but that's just a challenge I need to overcome,
I mean,
right?
That's been in every tradition. I mean, whether it's Hinduism or Christianity. I mean, the Gnostics, who were the Christian mystics, which pretty much the Catholic Church tried to eradicate completely. They talk about that. Like, when the Nag Hammurabi scrolls came out, and they talk about, the lost gospel of Thomas, they talk about archons, and they talk about the demiurge, and how basically, archons are basically bad angels, that was created, and that when this earth was created, there was an evil force that came in, which started manipulating everything. Some people can call it the devil. I don't, it's up to you what you want to call it. But there's that very famous parable in the Bible when Jesus goes out into the desert for 40 days to meditate. And, the devil shows up, tells him, just if you kneel to me, I'll give you anything you want. I'll make you the prince of this world. And he shows them the riches, he shows them the cities, and he shows them women, this and that. And Jesus basically tells them, screw off. I'm not interested.
And maybe if you take that path, you will have ability to possess those earthly things, right? And maybe to some people they're satisfied with that, but to gain more abilities and to level up more, you have to bypass that.
Yeah, but it's a trap. It's a trap. I mean, because once you get into that whole materialism trap, the more you have, the more you want.
Do you believe a person can, I don't know, go through this experience and walk into the dark side, so to speak, and experience it and walk out of it and walk into the light again?
I think it's possible, but I think you have to be a very evolved soul and very spiritually strong and, cognizant and know yourself very well to be able to do that.
So what is Earth? Why we're here? What is our universe? Like the way you perceive it?
Because Earth, if you really look at it, is an anagram for the word heart.
Mm-hmm.
We're here to love. That's it.
That's it. We're here to learn how to love ourselves
and everything. The earth, there was this German mystic, I forget his name, but he had a really interesting book and a theory saying that the way the universe has been built and laid out is that there are certain planets that are the lungs of the universe, there's certain galaxies that are the brain of the universe, but the earth is literally the heart of the universe, and if we screw up the heart, we're screwed, period.
So what is love?
That's the question for the ages, isn't it? I think it's just basically, I think it really boils down to the golden rule. Treat other people the way you want them to treat you.
That's gorgeous. So back to spiritual travel, do you recommend, like, let's say, if I'm going for some dark period in my life, do you recommend any places to go and travel to help you to release that darkness and to regain your light essence?
I think it really depends on the individual because everybody's different and everyone's path is going to be different, which is why I do the consulting, because of my training as a spiritual counselor and a trauma counselor, to do an assessment on a person. Because once I hear your story and I know what kind of themes you're grappling with, and it's on the basis of that I can design something and tell you, okay, because of what you're going through right now, you need to go to Western Ireland and maybe visit the Holy Wells in County Clare, for example.
What would it be attributed to, for example? I'll give you an example. We'll be devil's advocate. I'm going for abandonment issue. I have a terrible relationship with my dad, and all my female partnerships always fall apart. How do I find center? Where do I go?
Oh, that it's not as simple as that. I'd have to do a much more complete assessment than that.
Okay, I understand. So what kind of question would you ask?
Well, I'd have to know basically what are your spiritual practices? What have you believed in the background, in your background? What do you believe in now? What's your practice now? What got you into this funk? Is there a history of depression in your life or not? What kind of traditions you're into. I need to basically rule out something psychiatric, for example, to really figure out if this is something really spiritual that's bothering you. And then on the basis of that, I would probably have to, work with you to see what an itinerary that would work for you.
Does it work for couples?
Yeah. So that's why a lot of people go to Hawaii, the big island, because there's a lot of energy around the volcanoes. Usually places where there's a lot of seismic energy, whether it's volcanoes or earthquakes, they happen to be very, very powerful spiritual places like Hawaii. That it's also not a coincidence that Mount Shasta in California is one of the most spiritual places because of California and the San Andreas Fault. Whenever you have a lot of these places, also Italy, Greece, Turkey, earthquake zones, whenever the earth releases a lot of those kinds of energies, there is a lot of spiritual good energy there too. It's strange, but it's true.
This is all very fascinating, but going back to your blog, and I read a lot of your articles, and one I'm very interested about is why I left yoga. As you're aware, I'm a yoga instructor myself, and I practice yoga daily. So I'm very interested to hear about this. What prompted you to write this article?
Well, I wrote this article in 2012, and unbeknownst to me, it got picked up by Elephant Journal and it went viral. And that kind of also put me on the blogosphere map, so to speak. There was also this kind of spa yoga that's been developing, which is kind of like, okay, if it's exercise, it's exercise. That's one thing. But if it's a spiritual practice, it's a spiritual practice. But people were trying to say, well, this is a spiritual practice, but it really wasn't. It was more a place to get your workout, basically, like Bikram yoga, for example.
But at the
hot
same
yoga.
time, that's kind of how I started my travel in yoga. I started doing it as an exercise, and it's eventually evolved.
No, but the thing is, that great thing about yoga is that it is very therapeutic. I mean, people who have had back problems or, carpal tunnel syndrome, they get a lot of benefit from doing yoga over time. So people do change over time. It's just that I think people's intentions of when they were going into yoga and what they were trying to make it into was totally at odds of what the real message of yoga was.
But you left yoga in the Western perception.
Absolutely.
But you haven't left yoga as a spiritual practice.
No, absolutely
Okay.
not.
And you got millions of hits from that, and it was a really good article, and we're very happy to have you here.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bobbie, for this wonderful interview, and we're going to see a lot more of you on Alex's show.
There you go. Thank you.